Hey everyone, Shlomo Brody here. As many communities begin to have Torah readings again, preferably outside but sometimes inside, many are asking the question about whether they have to make up for all the missed weeks in which we did not read Torah on Shabbat. In truth, this has been a fascinating conversation amongst poskim over the past few weeks. The Ashkenazic chief rabbi, Rav David Lau, says you don't. The Sephardic chief rabbi in Israel, Rav Yosef, says you do. And other poskim have taken sides in different directions. Now, Torah reading originates, according to Maseches Sofrim, already from Moshe Rabbeinu. The Gemara in Bava Kama also has a discussion, maybe Ezra added things, and in general we assume it to be that Moshe plus Ezra ordained the Torah reading on Shabbat, on Mondays and Thursdays, and on Shabbat afternoon. Part of the idea, of course, was to make sure that the community was constantly learning Torah. Part of the idea also was to make sure that within every 3 days there was always a communal Torah reading. Once Torah reading was ordained, the question becomes, what happens if Kehillah misses a Torah reading? And there are two major approaches taken in the Rishonim. One approach, classically attributed to the Maram Mintz, basically says the laws of Torah reading work like the laws of Tefillah. In Tefillah, we have a rule. If you miss, by accident or by compulsion, by ones, a Tefillah, then you're allowed to make up, do tashlumim, the Tefillah in the next time period. So, for example, if you miss Mincha, you can do tashlumim in Marav and say Shemona Esrei twice. If you miss Mincha one day, you can't make it up the next day on Shacharit. You only had one time slot, the slot of Marav, in order to make it up. And the Maram Mintz says that this same rule applies with Torah reading as well. He cites the ruling of the Or Zarua to defend this position and gives a number of different arguments. The minhag of the world, he says, is we never have more than 2 parshiot read on a given week. Sometimes we'll combine parshiot like Vayakal Pekudei, but it's unheard of, he says, to add on a third parsha. Moreover, he says, listen, if you do that, ein l'davar sof, right? There's no limits to what you can do. Maybe you have 3, maybe 4, you may have 5. It just doesn't make sense. He cites the fact that once you finish a chumash, let's say Sefer Shmot, we don't have a concept, he says, of extending, of carrying on to it from Sefer Vayikra. So, for example, if you missed Vayakal Pekudei, can you make it up in Vayikra? He says no. A, because that would have 3 different parshiot together, and B, we don't jump from one chumash to another. Now, the Ramah cites this position as well and says that you have an opportunity to make it up only on the next Shabbat, implying perhaps that you don't have the possibility of making up multiple Shabbatot in a given week. And while it's implied in the Ramah, this is explicit in the Magen Avram, who follows the Maram Mintz. We don't do more than 2 parshiot in a given week. We don't jump from one chumash to another. And the logic, as the Gra points out, seems to be that we follow the principles of Tashlumin when it comes to Tefillah. We only make up 1 week in the next slot. But as the Magen Avram notes, there are many who dissented from the position of the Maram Mintz already soon after his time period, and certainly afterwards. The posek who took the strongest position against the Maram Mintz was probably the Aruch HaShulchan, who was very vehemently against it and stated that a community has an obligation to complete the entire Torah cycle over the course of the year, and there's no limit. It can be 3 parshiot, it can be 4 parshiot, it can be 5 parshiot. It doesn't matter. You gotta finish a Torah, and that means even if in a given week you jump from one chumash to another. To understand this position, it pays briefly to understand the history of Torah reading. Now, if you look in the Gemara, it tells us that there are different minhagim about how often they'd finish the entire Torah cycle. The Bavli states that the minhag in Eretz Yisrael was to read the Torah over the course of 3 years, and some minhagim recorded being 3.5 years. In Bavel, the minhag was 1 year, but throughout the first centuries of the Common Era, there were different minhagim in different places around the world. In fact, the Rambam records that in his own time period in Egypt, there were different minhagim in different shuls. Many did the Torah cycle in 1 year, but some had the minhag of doing it over the course of 3+ years. Over time, however, it became uniform to complete the Torah cycle over 1 year. But the question became, well, how do you accomplish that goal, given that some years there's more weeks and some years there's less because of leap years? And the Rishonim note the fact that this way to solve this is to play around with double parshiot. But there are different minhagim in different communities about which parshiot we should combine. The Sefer Chazat Nufa, who's a student of the Rosh, mentions this. The Meiri mentions this as well. And the notion basically seems to be that we have an obligation, a chovah, to complete the Torah cycle. In fact, that seems to be the idea of Shtayim Mikra V'Echa B'Targum, right? This concept that we constantly go through the year to be mashlim the Torah. But how to do that is not a chovah. How to do that is a minhag. And in different communities, they combine different parashiot throughout the course of the year to accomplish the goal of completing this Torah cycle by Simchat Torah. With that background in mind, we can understand the actual tshuva of the Or Zarua in the case that emerged in his time period. It seems that there was a communal dispute or feud that emerged during davening one week, and they weren't able to read the parsha, as Parshas Emor, and the question was, in the following week, should they make up Parshat Emor? Now, the Or Zarua gives a number of different arguments for his position, one of which basically says that the chovah, as he understands it, from the time of Ezra, is that we should complete the entire Torah cycle over the course of the year. And it doesn't really matter how you do it. Now, the Or Zarua gives a number of different arguments. His basic claim, however, is that the obligation from the times, from Moshe, from Ezra, is to complete the Torah throughout 1 year. And he cites a number of different conditional arguments to prove this point. He says, first of all, what happens when Yom Tov falls out on Shabbat in a given year? So we play around with the Torah reading schedule, but we always make sure to finish the Torah throughout the year. He also notes the fact that what happens if a kehillah realizes after they finish the Torah reading that they had skipped a pasuk, we make them reread the entire Torah portion. It's tircha de tzibor, it's difficult. It doesn't matter. There's a chovah on the tzibor to complete the Torah cycle throughout the course of the year. And many Achronim follow this position as well, and claim that kehillah has an obligation to complete the Torah cycle throughout the course of the year. It's a very interesting and compelling argument in many ways, but there are good counter-arguments as well. Rav Asher Weiss, however, points out that if kehillah did not meet or is not regularly meeting, then there may not be any obligation since Kriyat Torah only falls out on the kehillah. So, for example, if the kehillah didn't meet 1 week, or regularly doesn't meet, it's like a monthly minyan or something along those lines, then there's clearly no obligation, he wants to claim, to say that the kehillah would have to go in that circumstance to make up what they didn't miss because they weren't actually meeting together as a kehillah. The Or Zarua only applied in a case where the kehillah was meant to read the Torah, but then didn't end up reading it because of a feud. In our circumstance as well, because kehillot have been broken apart and people are reading the Torah sometimes in private minyanim and various other places, that also might be a mitigating factor as well to say that in this circumstance the kehillah really didn't exist in this time period, unfortunately. Now that we're coming together, fortunately, we don't have to complete or make up for the readings which we didn't have a chovah for since the kehillah didn't exist during this time period. But there's another factor as well, which goes back to the core claim of the Or Zarua. We'll recall the Or Zarua said that the Torah reading obligation made by Moshe and Ezra is that the Torah cycle should be completed over the course of the year. Is that true? Historically, that wasn't the case in Eretz Yisrael. And moreover, if you look at the language of the text, it seems what's being emphasized isn't that the Torah reading should be completed over the course of the year, but rather that the Torah reading should happen on a regular basis, on Shabbat every week, and even every 3 days to make sure that we don't go 3 days without a Torah reading. But sometimes what are you going to do? There's a case of ones. There's a case where we simply cannot have a Torah reading, and therefore there's no point in making up for the Torah reading because those days are lost. That opportunity was lost. Not to be blamed for it, nothing wrong that anyone did, but there's just no way we can go back and make up for missed time in this respect. And therefore many poskim, of Hershel Schachter, of Asher Weiss, of David Lau, and others, have asserted that in this circumstance, there's no reason a kehillah should feel obligated to go back and repeat all of the missed parsha. However, these insights might give us a solution for the missed bar-mitzvah parshas over this period. Now, we could have a situation where in a given community, there are enough boys to go around who can say, okay, one Shabbat, we'll have everyone read their bar mitzvah parsha and complete the entire cycle, to do it on behalf of the entire community. But in other communities where that's not possible, Rav Hershel Schachter has made a very interesting claim, in which he suggests that on a given week, we can do the regular Torah portion, but for maftir, instead of reading the regular last 3 psukim of the parsha, we can instead allow the bar mitzvah boy to read a previous parsha. After all, as we've seen, there's a certain amount of flexibility in the minhagim of what we read on a given parasha. This is certainly true for maftir, an additional reading. And if the community is willing to agree to it and take on the tircha, so to speak, of listening to another reading, we can allow the boy to read this bar-mitzvah parasha, or at least part of it, and do his haftorah as well. This is understandable if you understand the history of Torah reading and the flexibility that's gone through the minhagim of how we complete the cycle over the course of the year.